Notice, this video will include frank discussions of sex. If in your country or culture you are considered too young for this material, do not watch this video. Welcome back into the Bangtan universe wormhole. We're heading into the home stretch now in our discussion of the Wings era. After covering Boy Meets Evil and the 7 short films, we're finally ready to tackle Blood, Sweat, and Tears, both versions. I'll be covering the Korean version in 2 videos, then discussing the Japanese version in 1 video. I can promise you many surprises in both versions. So let's get started. If you're new to our channel, you may not know about the Bangtan universe yet, and if that's the case, then you need to watch this video before you go any farther. Otherwise, you won't have a clue what's going on. You also need to know a little bit about the novel Daemyeon, since it plays a huge role in this era. So if you haven't been following my discussion of the short films, pause the video and read this brief summary before continuing. And now let's get on to the good stuff. The video for Blood, Sweat, and Tears, which I'm going to call BST from now on, begins with the boys entering what looks like a museum gallery full of artwork. Notice that they're entering from the bottom of the frame at what would be the front entrance in a real gallery. At the end of the video, we'll see them exit at the rear of the gallery, and in between are representations of all the temptations and struggles they'll face on the road to individuation. Not that they'll complete individuation when they reach the end of the gallery, but they'll be one step closer. Now right away you can see that Seokjin is walking alone and looking solemn, because as I told you in my analysis of Awake, he's responsible for leading the others through this time of trials and tribulations. Meanwhile, everyone else looks carefree, and you can see them separating into their Hyung-Mangne pairs that the photo shoots predicted. The first pair we see is Yoongi and Jimin, and at first they're acting like children, with Yoongi on a kid's bike and Jimin chasing him with a slingshot. Their characters aren't literally this childish, but the bike and the slingshot tell us that they're totally unprepared for what this gallery symbolizes. The point becomes even clearer when they relax against this nude statue, which for the record is called Crouching Venus. They're not even giving her a glance. One of the biggest temptations we face at this stage of development is sexual attraction. But because of their difficult lives, Yoongi and Jimin haven't even had time to consider dating anyone. Next, we see Namjoon and Jungkook facing the whole gallery of statues without noticing them any more than Yoongi and Jimin did. Namjoon has his head in a book, which is totally fitting for his character and for the real Namjoon. The character spends what little money he has on books, and in the Love Yourself era, he begins teaching himself by reading library books. At the same time, in BST, he's teaching Jungkook, but don't be too impressed. If you see my analysis of Reflection, you know that Namjoon is a very unreliable mentor. Finally, we have Hoseok and Taehyung studying a fully dressed statue. This is the Empress Livia, a real historical figure and the mother of 2 more emperors, and she's dressed as the Titan Ops, or Rhea as she's called in Rome. Rhea was the mother of 6 gods, and she saved their lives when they were babies when her husband tried to kill them. Now Hoseok and Taehyung are the only pair actually looking at a statue, but it's only natural that Hoseok fixated on the most powerful mother figure in the room. Now why is he looking at her through opera glasses? That wouldn't work. Well, not until you remember that he tends to see his mother's features in other women's faces. That's what he's trying to do with Livia right now. Meanwhile, Taehyung is just happy to be with him because Hoseok is more consistently kind than Namjoon was. Eventually, Hoseok turns his opera glasses away from Livia, but before we move on, I want to point out one more thing about this statue. See that book lying at its base? The only other book in the room is the one Namjoon is reading, so this book must be an Easter egg, right? I think it is. It's probably a nod to Carl Jung, whose journals were compiled and published after his death in a volume called The Red Book. Now we can move on to see what caught Hoseok's eye. It's Seokjin standing alone and staring at this painting, The Fall of the Rebel Angels. Seokjin looks solemn and slightly worried because he has a special responsibility for his friends. And no, I'm not talking about the time travel. As the senior member of the group, he has the job of leading the others through this metaphorical gallery, and in the process they have to lose their innocence. But because Seokjin's father is a heartless control freak, Seokjin never lost his own innocence. So now, looking at this painting of rebel angels falling into hell, he's worried about how far his friends might fall when they lose their innocence. That's why, even as he studies the painting, we hear the first strains of music, and it's not blood, sweat, and tears. This is a piece by Bach called Mass in B minor, Kyrie, and it's about asking God for forgiveness. I've already described some of the artwork in the gallery, but this is the most important room in the MV, and there's a lot you need to know about it. We'll begin with a quick look at the rest of the statues in the room. Here is the famous Venus de Milo, who's half-clothed, unlike the crouching Venus that Yoongi and Jimin were ignoring. You probably know that Venus is the goddess of love, romance, attraction, and sexual intimacy, so it's no coincidence that we see two images of her in this gallery. It's also no coincidence that in the novel Damian, when Sinclair hears the name Abraxas and takes his first steps towards individuation, the first thing he notices is an increase in his libido. This next statue is actually just a small portion of a larger piece, Laocoon and his sons, which shows the three figures being crushed to death by Athena during the Trojan War. But we don't need all those details to understand the Wings era or BST. All we need to do is look at Laocoon's face, which one art critic called the prototypical icon of human agony in Western art. Despite what BST shows us, this period of human development is a time of agony. I mean, does anybody really like their teenage years? Now here's Perseus with the head of Medusa. This statue gives us two Jungian archetypes for the price of one. Perseus is the classical Jungian hero, and Medusa is an example of the negative mother. The statue that caught Hoseok's attention, Olivia dressed as Ops, is a great example of the positive mother archetype, someone who's loving, nurturing, and protecting. On the other hand, the negative mother archetype, like Medusa, abuses and/or abandons children. Now here's the Ares Borghese. The real statue has arms and legs, but by leaving them out of this copy, the set designers force you to focus on his torso and sexual organs. Speaking of which, notice how many of these columns aren't holding up anything. They're just standing there, looking like the phallic objects they are. Now let's look at the contrasting black and white doorways on the walls. During this stage of life, when we struggle with temptation and sometimes willingly experiment with forbidden thoughts and actions, we're also considering the things we've been taught and making our own decisions about right and wrong. So these black and white doors are challenging our heroes to make decisions about right and wrong. And notice that none of the doors are entirely black or entirely white. The so-called black doors are actually marbled with lighter colors, and the so-called white doors are really beige. In other words, all the doors are like life. They're all in shades of gray. But what about the exit from the gallery, where two black lintels stand one behind the other? They make it seem like the only way out of the gallery is to choose evil. But it only looks that way now from our view at the entrance to the gallery. You'll see what I mean soon. Now we're almost ready to move on to the next room, but before we go, I want to answer a question that I'm sure some of you are asking. Since the BU characters are mostly middle class and lower class, why are they dressed like rich people in BST? And why are they wandering around in what looks half like a museum and half like a mansion? The answer comes from the Wings concept book. The story of having to go through agony in order to grow up, rather than describing a specific situation, created the vibe they want to show and explain the concept of temptation, decadence, and growth. From the youth portrayed by the green candy, green smoke, and monotonous colors, they went out into a more complicated, more glamorous, and chaotic world. So that's all you need to know right now about the gallery. We'll take a quick peek into it again soon, just for a moment, but after that we'll be able to forget about it until the climax. I'm calling this room a parlor because that's the word for a room used to receive guests. And right now BTS look like they're receiving us as guests into their scene. The camera even zooms in to make us feel like we're walking toward them. So let's study the members for a moment while they're sitting there. Taehyung is sitting between Hoseok, his new mentor, and Namjoon, his old mentor, but he's much closer to Hoseok, and there's an entire chandelier between him and Namjoon. That's because he's still angry about Namjoon's betrayal, which I described in my analysis of reflection. Namjoon wasn't there in Taehyung's greatest moment of need, and he's basically unreliable as a mentor in general. But now he's trying to mentor Jungkook. and they're sitting at opposite ends of the sofa right now. That doesn't bode well. Now let's look at Yoongi and Jimin, who are about to bring this scene to a screeching halt. When Yoongi tries to cover Jimin's eyes, Jimin shoves his hand away, and we switch to another location. Now Yoongi means well. He always sensed the pain and vulnerability Jimin was hiding, and he also feels guilty about how he treated Jungkook. So he's trying to protect Jimin during this era, but Jimin isn't having it. Only 3 pieces of art in this room need any attention. The first is on the ceiling. It's a fresco from Ljubljana Cathedral, and it's called The Glory of St. Nicholas. Now, including a saint in BST makes sense because saints are known for suffering because of their beliefs, technically just like our heroes. And St. Nicholas is the perfect saint for our purposes. First, he appears on a tarot card, and I've explained before that the BU hides a lot of important information in tarot cards. St. Nicholas appears on the Hierophant card, and when that card is inverted, it's associated with passing down wisdom, unlocking mysteries, initiations, and other rites of passage. Every bit of that applies to the current era. The second reason St. Nicholas is appropriate is because it gives Big Hit the chance to hide a very sly Easter egg in one of the Wings photo shoots. One of St. Nicholas's most famous miracles is called The 3 Boys in the Tub. The short version of the story is that 3 young men were killed and stuffed into a tub of brine, but St. Nicholas resurrected them. Now, with the 3 boys in the tub in mind, take a look at this picture. It's pretty clever, right? Now let's move on. Over here on the right is Landscape with the Fall of Icarus by Bruegel the Elder. This painting will have a bigger role in another scene, so I just want you to notice that it's here, and that the main painting in the room is also of Icarus. This large version is by Herbert James Draper, and it's called The Lament for Icarus. Here we see Icarus's body being pulled from the water by nymphs who are mourning his death. Now keep in mind that this is the same room we're going to see Jungkook flying in. The fact that we have 2 paintings of Icarus in here tells us that Jungkook is doing something that could be dangerous. It also invites us to ask questions like, do we all have to fly, or can some of us stay on the ground? And if we fly, are we doomed to fall like Icarus? Finally, I need to address the neon sign in the room. It says The Tempter. But who or what is the Tempter? You know the Wings era is about temptation because I've been saying that from the start, but I've never said anything about the cause of that temptation. Later on, we'll find out who Sinclair identifies, or used to identify, as the Tempter, but we never get a final answer on that subject. It's one of those things we have to work out for ourselves while we're working out our whole belief systems. None of the Magnes have their own rooms. They come into their Hyung's rooms for mentoring, and none of them have done that yet. I'll explain why shortly. But Taehyung is the only one who ever appears on this balcony, and eventually you'll see him throw himself off it. His character really has a thing for jumping, doesn't he? Yoongi's room is sparse. You can see almost everything there is to see at a glance. The only features that need a bit of explaining are the rear doors, which lead onto the balcony, and the glass under Yoongi's feet, which is a window down into Namjoon's room. Yoongi's room has some green smoke in it, and the Wings concept book tells us that green is the color of youth. That tallies with what we saw of him in the gallery. But by the time Jimin enters the room, the green smoke will be gone and we'll see a more mature, though anxious, version of Yoongi. When the boys were in the parlor and Yoongi covered Jimin's eyes, Jimin pushed Yoongi's hand away. But I didn't show you what happened next because I hadn't finished exploring the parlor yet. Now I can show you what happened next. We return to the gallery for the first lyrics and dance break. I don't need to talk about those, but I do want to talk about the change to the gallery's layout. The set decorators had to move the statues away in order to make room for the members to dance, but that's not all they did. They moved the 2 black lintels away from the exit, turning it into something positive rather than negative, and they repurposed the lintels as arches for the most important statues in the gallery, Perseus and Livia. Since Perseus is a hero archetype, and Livia is both a mother archetype and a titan, they're now male and female guardians on the road to the next stage of individuation. As BST progresses, we'll see Jungkook progress too in his attempts to fly. But Suga said in a behind-the-scenes video that all of the members get their wings. So Jungkook is just a visual representative for something all of them are going through. And because most of his scenes in the parlor are pretty similar, I won't try to share them all with you. I'll just point out a few important elements of this first attempt at flight. We can begin by noticing the swing. Jungkook starts learning to fly with support. Later on, he'll be able to float and fly on his own. The Wings Tour concert trailer gives us another view of this process. The trailer starts with Jungkook swinging, but the swing is made of what looks like glass. Then he disappears, and when the swing comes back into view, it's on fire. I can think of a couple of explanations for the fire. The first is that the force of his liftoff was as strong as a rocket, and that's why the swing caught fire. The second and more probable explanation is that he took flight at the last possible moment, and if he'd waited any longer, he would have been destroyed. This explanation would make sense considering his state of mind at the end of Notes 2. Next, notice that Jungkook has a lollipop in his mouth. We've seen Namjoon with a lollipop in other MVs, and in the highlight reel, Yoongi's girl gives him a lollipop to replace his cigarettes. So this seems to be a symbol of innocence or return to innocence. As for Jungkook, he'll ditch his lollipop when he ditches the swing. Finally, think about the questions I mentioned with regard to Icarus, especially the question of whether we have to fly or whether we can stay on the ground. As long as Jungkook sits in the swing, he has to stay close to the ground. And at one point, he leans back so far that his hair almost brushes the floor. Now here's an interesting moment. All 6 of Seokjin's friends are covering his eyes, even though he's supposed to be leading them. Now you've already seen Yoongi covering Jimin's eyes, and you'll see him do it again. You'll also see all 7 members close their eyes while they're dancing. But what are they trying to block out? I already explained about Yoongi and Jimin. Yoongi is trying to protect Jimin from harm. Now in the dance breaks, the members cover their eyes only while they're grabbing their crotches, and that to me conveys the idea that they're blindly succumbing to temptation. But the scene where Seokjin's friends cover his eyes is unique. I think they're doing it because they realize he's more innocent than they are, and even though he's supposed to be their leader, they don't want him to see what they're getting up to. The first thing we see in Namjoon's room is booze, specifically a glass of absinthe and the candle he's using to prepare it. Absinthe was the favorite drink of decadent artists, writers, and poets in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The biggest problem with this drink is that if you drink it straight, it tastes pretty awful. It has to be sweetened with sugar and diluted in water. The decadent artists, writers, and poets like to make the process a little fancier by setting the sugar on fire before pouring the absinthe over it. Of course, Namjoon's character wouldn't know anything about preparing absinthe. He might not even know it exists, and he'd prefer soju even if he did. But remember that BST uses decadence to show how the boys are descending into temptation, struggle, and experimentation. Now let's take a quick look at Namjoon's room before we move on. It seems very old-fashioned and European, which fits with the absinthe. But we don't need to study all its details because their only purpose is to make Namjoon look worldly, which he isn't. He's putting on a show for Jungkook, and that's particularly obvious when you look at the antlers, which really don't belong in a room that looks like this one. But this isn't the first time we've seen antlers in BTS videos. We saw them in RM's solo single Do You, and then in Jungkook's short film Begin. Now why are they here? Antlers symbolize masculine strength, fertility, and virility. It's an alpha male kind of thing. But we know Namjoon's character isn't even a real adult, much less an alpha male, so the antlers are just a show for Jungkook. Now here's Jungkook's bird sketch, which Namjoon set on fire in reflection before tossing it into a glass of liquor and drinking it. This looks like a repetition of that scene, only with absinthe instead of liquor. But the alcohol doesn't matter, only the message. Namjoon can't be relied on to help you with anything because his biggest concern is always himself. That's why his motto is "You must survive." Or maybe we can say that's what his motto has made of him. Hoseok is sitting in a pool of water, which according to the Wings concept book represents chocolate. That's because in the novel Damien, Sinclair's mother used to comfort him with chocolate. And of course Hoseok comforts himself with chocolate because his mother left him a candy bar when she abandoned him. You can ignore the arrow. For now, let's focus on the statue behind him. This is a copy of Michelangelo's famous piece, the Pieta. The word means pity or compassion, and the sculpture shows Mary cradling Jesus' body after his crucifixion. In other words, this is another image of the perfect, loving mother who wouldn't abandon her son. But speaking of the son, notice that in this image, Jesus' body is only half formed. This is because Hoseok himself is only half formed. Remember the doctor's diagnosis in the Mama short film. Hoseok's thinking is irrational and doesn't match his age. Inside, he's still a little boy who believes his mother will come back someday. Taehyung's role in this MV is often misinterpreted, but the veil is key to understanding it. Take a look at this clip from a behind-the-scenes video where Taehyung says his character's story has pain behind it, that his wings were ripped off, and that he'll rise up again in the end. The pain he's referring to is Namjoon's betrayal, which I've already discussed. Now, the betrayal occurred in one of the time loops where Taehyung killed his father, and as we know, Seokjin figured out how to prevent that tragedy. But we also know Taehyung's character has a special gift that gives him flashes of memory from old loops. For instance, he remembers killing his father over and over again, as he says in the notes. So he might remember Namjoon's failure to answer his call that day. But even if he doesn't, he still remembers another phone call Namjoon made, a phone call Taehyung misinterpreted to mean Namjoon didn't want to take care of him anymore. So there were plenty of reasons for Taehyung to be in pain right now under this veil, with his wings ripped off. But in the Wings Tour concert trailer, we actually see his wings grow back. So we know the scars he has at the end of BST aren't marks of sin or failure, they're marks of pain. Now we come to the first real moment of change in the MV. This is the scene where Seokjin takes the lead as his friends prepare to begin their time of struggle. As you can see from the fancy tableware, the apples on everyone's plates, and the toast they make together, Seokjin views this as a formal event, an initiation. That's why they're all wearing white, the color of purity, and in some fraternal organizations, the color of pre-initiation. This tradition goes back at least as far as the ancient Greek mystery cults, whose initiates often dressed in white. As for the sky, I think it might signify that the boys are in a sort of otherworldly space, which is what the ancient Greek cults attempted to create in their initiations. There's just one problem with Seokjin's initiation. As he raises his cup, he looks backwards, just like he did in Awake as he was leaving his bedroom to start his mission. Once again, he's scared and having second thoughts. But that doesn't mean he's given up, and it doesn't mean his friends weren't initiated. I think they were, based on how the Hyungs and Maknaes come together after the initiation, but I've reached the limit of my knowledge about age hierarchy and the responsibilities of eldest Hyungs in cases like this, so if anyone out there can add to my knowledge, please do drop a comment. At any rate, the Maknaes enter their Hyungs' rooms immediately after this ceremony, and the Hyungs do pick up initiating them after that. So I think that Seokjin's initiation was sufficient. I just don't know if he's supposed to do anything else beyond this point. It does seem like mostly he just watches after this. But even if he successfully began the process of struggle and growth for his friends, and even if he did all he was supposed to do, he hasn't done it for himself. He's just as innocent as ever. As you'll see in the second half of this video, he remains behind after the others leave, and he makes a small, sad gesture all by himself. And if you've watched BST often enough and thought about the ending deeply enough, you can guess who initiates him in the end. But that's all for this video. I spent a lot of time setting the scene because it's a very big scene, and even so I had to leave out a lot of material I wanted to include. I hope you'll ask me a lot of questions in the comments section because I'm dying to tell you more. All I need is the tiniest nudge. But for now, I'll just ask you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Thanks, and Apo Bangpo.